Will we ever be free? Jara, Shayna, mother called. I need to give Yanni and Raphael a bath tonight. Take 2 clay pots and go to the well down by the Nile River. That one is bound to be less crowded. Please be quick. Yes, mother, the girls responded, picking up the clay jars and heading toward the Nile. The air was cool and crisp, fresh from the rain that had washed away all the dust that afternoon. There was not much happening that evening. Everyone must be resting for work tomorrow, Jara told herself as they walked through the sandy streets. As they turned down a side street, they saw 2 young ladies a little farther ahead of them, talking quietly together and heading towards the Nile River. Look, Shayna, it's Amisa and Ada. The 2 girls picked up their pace and soon came up behind their friends. Shalom, Ada exclaimed cheerfully, but Jara noticed that she was a little paler than usual. I haven't seen you ladies in quite some time. We didn't know you were back, Shayna said. When did you return? I just came back this evening, and I won't be staying long. Why not? Jara asked. The queen needs me, Ada answered, rather sadly. How did you get to visit? Shayna asked. Well, some people have, let's just say, ill thoughts of me, Ada replied hesitantly. A worried look crossed her usually happy face. What happened? Shayna gasped, voicing Jara's question as well as her own. Ada paused, then seemed to make up her mind to tell them the story. I was attacked by an Egyptian servant who was angry with the Hebrews. Thankfully, a young Egyptian steward saw him and stopped the man from hurting me. My attacker was arrested, but the queen thought it would be better for me to get away from the palace until the investigation and execution take place. I'm glad you're unharmed, Shayna breathed out in relief. I would be scared to death if something like that happened to me. Well, I must admit I was pretty shaken at first, Ada began. But I've given my fear over to Yahweh, and I know that He will protect me, and though I'm not completely at peace, Yahweh has made it very clear that He's not finished with me yet. But you're going back? Jara asked. Yes, I am. I don't have a choice, Ada said, wiping a tear from her eye. We all want her to stay here, but if we refuse, our whole family will get punished, and Ada will be taken back anyway, Amisa put in. So father said we must let her go, and that we should pray for her all the time. I will pray for you too, Jara added. Thank you, Jara, but I see that you're going to get water, too, Ada said, trying to turn the conversation to a more cheerful subject. Let's continue our conversation as we get the water. We don't want to be out after dark. Our families would start to worry about us. The foursome walked out of the side street and found themselves on the banks of the Nile River. There were few houses in this area, only fields and gardens for the Israelites. A couple of men and boys were working on their plots of ground, but the area was pretty open and free of people. The sun was just sinking behind the sand dunes, and its last rays illuminated the warm sand in golden colors and made the Nile River glow. The reeds whistled sorrowfully for the now devastated Egyptian people and clung to the girls' skirts as they walked past. Jara was glad that there was still vegetation in Goshen. The Egyptian land was very dead and dry, with barely a single green thing on it. No sound was heard except for the wind rippling the water and the reeds' sorrowful song and the soft tread of their bare feet against the warm sand. The breeze felt wonderfully cool after such a hot day. Jara, despite the beautiful evening, began to feel disheartened. Ada was going to be going back to the palace soon, and maybe into grave danger. And then there were the Egyptians. They had gone through all these plagues, and Pharaoh still wouldn't let the Hebrews go. They had been working for so long, and everyone had kept on telling her, "We will be free soon, just wait and see." But they were still not free. As a matter of fact, they were far from it. She wondered whether their lives were even safe. Perhaps the threat on Ada's life was just the beginning of threats to the rest of the Hebrews. Will we ever be able to see the promised land? To her horror, Jara realized that she had spoken her thoughts aloud. Shayna and Ada, who were walking just in front of her, turned around to look at her questioningly. I'm sorry, Jara muttered with a sigh. I was just thinking. You do a lot of that, Shayna said, annoyed. I understand what you mean, Jara, replied Ada kindly. I have often wondered the same thing, and it amazes me that Pharaoh is so stubborn. I just don't understand it. But here's the well. The girls took turns lowering their pots into the crystal clear water. Ada stood a little apart from the others. The last rays of sun shone on her pale face as Ada looked up towards the darkening sky and at the one lone star she could see shining. Ada is so pretty and wise, Jara thought. I wish that she was my sister, too. She's about the same age as Shayna, yet she seems older, calmer, and wiser. I guess being a servant to the queen makes her more mature, and she also worships Yahweh and not the Egyptians' gods. I wonder why she's not influenced by their beliefs. As Jara pulled her pitcher from the well, Ada turned to her and said, "To continue our conversation, I believe that Yahweh will not rest until he frees us. I believe that he is compassionate towards us and has heard our groaning at last. If we continue to trust him, he will sustain us and answer our prayers. As for Pharaoh, I think Yahweh has hardened his heart on purpose. I believe that he wants to utterly destroy Egypt so that he can show his greatness to all mankind." Amisa nodded. It seemed to make sense to her. Jara also nodded her head, but she was still not quite sure. "I understand. It's just hard for me to believe it sometimes," said Jara. "And I mean no disrespect." "Oh no, I do not blame you for your doubts," Ada quietly replied. "I sometimes doubt it myself, but I know Yahweh is behind all of this, and I will continue to trust in him." At this moment they heard footsteps behind them and turned to see Eaton, Lemuel, and Ezra. As Eaton approached, Jara could see Ada blush and turn her head away, even in the pale evening light. "Eaton, what are you doing here?" Shayna demanded. "We thought we should come walk back with you, since it's getting dark. We don't want anything to happen to you, since we heard what happened to Ada," replied Eaton, chancing a glance in Ada's direction. Ada's cheeks flushed again as she said, "Thank you all for being so considerate. You're welcome to join us." Eaton seemed pleased with her reply, and as they all started walking again, he took his place in between Shayna and Ada in the front of the group, a hopeful look on his face. "He probably already heard that Ada was back and was just looking for an excuse to see her," Jara told herself, suppressing a giggle. Ezra and Lemuel lagged behind. Jara looked over her shoulder and saw Ezra pluck a reed. He examined it and said to Lemuel, "I think I'll make a reed pipe out of this one, like Father has. I've used his before and wanted one of my own." Jara didn't hear Lemuel's reply because Amisa laughed quietly beside her and whispered to Jara, "I think Eaton and Ada like each other." "I know that Eaton likes her," but Jara cut herself off, remembering her promise not to tell Eaton's secret. Instead she whispered back, "You can just tell by the way he looks at her. It would be nice if he did marry her. Then you would be my sister." Amisa hid a chuckle behind her hand. "They'd make a pretty match, don't you think?" "Yes, but do you think it's possible, since Ada's a servant in the palace, that Eaton can get permission to marry her?" Jara asked, thinking back to Eaton's doubts. "I don't know," said Amisa, also becoming thoughtful. Ezra and Lemuel now came running forward to join the group. Suddenly Ezra exclaimed, "Jara, don't move." Jara froze instantly, and Amisa, who was only a foot or two to her right, stopped as well, almost in mid-step. Alarm filled Ezra's voice, and Jara heard Lemuel cry out in terror. Jara turned her head to the side. Just to her left in some of the reeds that bordered the Nile was an asp curled up a little less than 3 feet from her, ready to strike. Jara drew her breath and tried to remain as still as possible. She looked to see if Eaton saw her danger, but he and the 2 young ladies had already turned down the street towards their houses and were out of sight. Lemuel was about ready to panic. He knew that the bite of an asp is both painful and deadly to a grown man, not to mention a young girl. What could he do? If he tried to approach the snake and grab it by the neck, it might get alarmed and bite him or his sister. "What do I do?" Thoughts raced through his mind. "Ezra, do something," Amisa whispered fearfully as the snake hissed viciously. "Lemuel, help," Jara barely gasped out in fear. I'm thinking, Jara," Lemuel whispered, trying to comfort her, but he couldn't keep his own voice from shaking. Jara could tell from the tone in his voice that he was thinking very hard, but she could also hear the horror and fear that he felt. Slowly, Ezra reached into his tunic and pulled out the small dagger he kept there for self-protection. "I only have one try, so this has to be good," he thought. Ezra was very determined that neither Jara nor his sister would be hurt. He brushed his hair back from his eyes and focused hard upon the asp. He pulled back his arm and threw the dagger. It hit the snake, severing most of its head from its body. The snake's body convulsed and twisted, but it was completely powerless. Ezra simply walked up to the snake and finished disconnecting its head. Though the snake's body still struggled, everyone knew that the danger was past. Ezra silently dipped his bloody dagger in the Nile River and then wiped it clean. As he was doing this, Jara suddenly felt weak with how close she had been to getting killed, and she grabbed Amisa's outstretched arm for support. Lemuel came up behind his sister and offered her his arm as he asked, "Are you all right?" Jara smiled up weakly into her brother's worried face. I'm fine, just a little shaky." Then she turned her head, for Ezra had come up on her other side in case she was going to faint, and with a shy smile she whispered, "Thank you." He grinned back and said, "You're welcome. I'm glad Yahweh helped me protect you." Jara hung her head so as not to show her pale and yet blushing face as Amisa broke out into exclamations of praise and adoration for her older brother. Jara was very careful to watch where she stepped after that. Neither she nor anyone else ever wanted to be in that same situation ever again.